Okay, actually I have this recording, so what I'll get you to do is I'll just get you to introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Don Olsen, and I was born on the 31st of August, 1929, in a small town or corporation called the Municipality of McDonald. Unlike most people these days, I was born in a one-room house with a sleeping loft, without the aid of any medical people other than my grandmother, who attended my mother, and I was brought to life there. My father's name was Carl Linton Olsen, and my mother was named Ida May Polton Nee Olsen. We were, in 1929 was the start of the Great Depression, and money was very, very scarce. And although we lived on a farm, you still needed money for a few accessories. And I should tell you that the house that I was born in did not have electricity. It did not have a phone. It did not have running water, nor did it have an indoor toilet, although I wasn't needing that at the immediate time. My father owned this farm, which was three-quarters of a section, and he farmed it with a team of 4 horses, and we had 3 cows and a lot of chickens and a few pigs on the property. One thing that we did not have was a tree on the whole quarter section, and so we were constantly subjected to the winds, which never seemed to end, summer or winter. I grew up without having any friends or any neighbors, and the only thing that I had was a dog. And my father had rescued a young deer who had been abandoned by its mother, and we had the deer living on the property. One spring morning, when I was about 2.5 years old, my mother assigned me the chore of going out and picking eggs from the chickens who wandered throughout the whole property. So she gave me a basket, and off I went to pick up these eggs. The deer, of course, saw me with the basket and was quite interested in what I was doing. I filled the basket with eggs and started back to the house. And the deer really became aggressive because he wanted to see, he thought I had food in the basket for him. And he became very aggressive and reared up, and I, for some reason or other, stumbled and fell down, and he didn't strike me, but my father had seen this action going on, and that ended the friendship with a deer on the property, so we had just the dogs. And I think there was a couple cats on the property also. My grandparents were, the closest grandparents were Tom and Grandma Olsen, or Grandma Polton rather, and they were instrumental in helping us get established on this farm. In the Depression, very start of it, about 1930, 31, we had an invasion of grasshoppers. And like it says in the Bible, they descended from nowhere, and the skies were dark and black, and they landed and promptly ate everything on the property. They ate all the grass, they ate all the wheat and the oats, and they even chewed the paint off of our house. It was so bad that we had a screen door on the house, and you couldn't dare open that screen door because the house would become inundated with these grasshoppers. So there was, you always had to sweep with a broom and sweep all these darn grasshoppers off of the door before you could enter. Then, just like they appeared, they left. But when they left, there wasn't a thing green in sight. Everything was gone. And this, in essence, was the last straw for my father, because, as you say, with no crops to harvest, there would be no money coming in. So he had to find other work. And he took the job as a farm manager with a farm which was about 2.5 miles from where we lived. And so at the age of 3, I made my first move. And what a pleasure it was. This new house, or the new location, was located on the LaSalle River, which runs through Starbuck and runs through and enters into the Red River near Winnipeg. As I mentioned, where I had previously lived, there were no trees on the property. Well, this place was loaded with trees. There were oak trees and ash trees. I had never really seen a tree before, and I thoroughly enjoyed life there. There was shade, it was cool, and the leaves and the trees started to break the wind. And so that was my first move in the life of Don Olsen. Later on, I will introduce you to the family line where my great-great-grandfather Ole and Inger Olsen left Norway from a small town called Kristiansand and made their way to North America, and ultimately made their way to settle in Wisconsin and raise a family there, which is the beginning of the Olsen family. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay. My family history begins in the year 1852, when my great-grandfather, Ole, and his wife, Inger, living in a small village in Norway, in the southwest corner of Norway, decided to leave Norway and to make their way to the new land of North America. And they took a sailboat and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and landed in Boston. On arriving in Boston, they then took a train and went west to settle in a small town of Arkdale in Wisconsin. Ole set up, being a very ambitious man, set up a grocery store and rapidly became quite famous in the area. And he and his wife, Inger, raised 10 children, one of whom was my grandfather, Otis. In 1888, Otis married Orpha Henry. Interestingly enough, Orpha Henry's background was a direct relation to Patrick Henry, one of the fathers of Confederation of the American Revolution, who made the famous statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." And they married and moved from Wisconsin to settle in a small town called Portland in North Dakota. Here once again, they set up and started a retail place and raised 6 children: Henry, Cecil, Mildred, Hesper, and Florence. And Carol, my father, was born in 1899. Ironically enough, in 1899, Otis, who was always looking for advantages to get ahead, heard that there was land to be given away in Canada, especially in Manitoba, which was open for homesteading. So Otis took the train in 1900 and looked over the land around Starbuck and applied for a homestead permit. And in 1902, he moved to the homestead 2 miles south of Starbuck with his family of 6 on a quarter section of land. Now, I should mention that after applying for his homestead permit in 1899, Otis received his permit and he rode his bicycle from North Dakota up to Starbuck in the spring, and he worked on the land until fall freeze up, whereupon he jumped on his bicycle and rode back to North Dakota to spend the winter. He did that for 2 years in a row, and finally, in 1902, he moved the family up to Starbuck to a homestead which was located 2 miles south of Starbuck on a half section of land, and and settled in to make his fortune as a homesteader.
So let me ask you a question then. How did the family get from North Dakota to?
The family got from North Dakota up by train. Grandpa had managed to secure 2 rail cars, and they loaded their cattle and their livestock, horses, and all their belongings into those 2 rail cars and proceeded north to Winnipeg, were switched over at Winnipeg and dropped off at the siding in Starbuck, Manitoba. And from there, he unloaded his livestock and all his equipment, his wagons and so forth, and they proceeded to travel 2 miles south and settled into the homestead along with the 6 children and begin their life there.
Well, what kind of house did they have?
They had a fairly substantial house. At those times, unbeknownst to most people, Eaton's mail order carried full houses in their catalog, and you could order a house and have it delivered, and just like you bought a pair of pants or underwear, and it was delivered, and all you had to do was put it together. And he had put together this house in the year before they moved up there. It was quite a low, rambling house, but only 1 story, and it had a good-sized living room, a good-sized kitchen, and of course there was no electricity, there was no water or anything. He had to build a dugout to hold water as a reserve, carry them through for the winter and summer, and dig a well so that he could have water filtered through the sand and supply the house. So it was quite a convenience. He then, of course, once he had moved there, they had to build a barn and all the outbuildings. Well, of course, being in the 1900s, there were no facilities, and there's one of the buildings he had to build was a 2-seater toilet, which provided everybody with their facility for living. They built granaries to hold the grain that we would eventually thrash, and as I say, a large barn to contain the horses and the cows and the pigs. It was, as you remember, in 1900, there were no cars and no transportation other than horse and wagon or horse and buggy or horseback. And so in order to seed the land, they would go out and plow this ground and harrow it to smooth it off, and then in those days they had to just broad feed their grain across their sections to plant the seeds. It was pretty, as you can understand, very, very labor intensive, and anything that had to be done, you had to do it because there was nobody else to do it.
So how old was your father and his siblings when they moved to Manitoba?
Well, my father was the youngest of the family, and he had been born in 1899. And so at the time, he was only 4 or 5 years old. Cecil and Henry were born first, and they were already teenagers at that time. And of course, when the First World War started in 1914. Both Cecil and Henry joined the Canadian Army and served overseas in the First World War. My dad, still being a teenager, only achieved his 18th birthday in 1918, upon which time he decided that he would like to go back to America and join the American Navy. And he proceeded to make his way back to Chicago. He joined the American Navy and started training in the Navy. Unfortunately, when the war was over, just 6 months after my dad had joined the Navy, Dad found out that even though the war was over, he had signed up for 4 years, and as a consequence, he served in the Navy for 4 years on a ship that was moving refugees, veterans of the American Army and parts of their material back to America from Europe. And finally at 1922, Dad had served 4 years in the Navy, and he applied for and received his honorable discharge in the Great Lakes of America in Chicago, and he made his way back to Starbuck to join the family and begin his new life in Starbuck.
Now, what about the other siblings? What were they like? I mean, I know Florence was quite famous in her own right.
Yes,
So tell me what you can about
yes.
brothers.
Well, Henry was the oldest, and he was a very quiet man. He was a great carpenter, and he was not interested in working on the farm. He after he was discharged from the Army in 1918, he came back and settled in Winnipeg and worked as a carpenter building things, which left Cecil, the next oldest of the family, to become the senior Olsen in the area. And Cecil worked the land, half a section, and helped my grandfather, Otis, till the land and worked from there. Of the three girls, Florence stood out as the most prolific girl. She was the youngest girl, and she loved education, but unfortunately, after she had graduated from university, she caught TB and ended up living in those days. If you had TB, you were isolated and put in a institution where you were treated for your TB. And Flora spent some 5 odd years in an institution before she was cured of her TB. The other two girls, now Mildred, as I say, she left Starbuck and married a fellow in Roland, Manitoba, whose last name was Wright, and they had a large grocery store, and she lived there. The other daughter, Hesper, as I mentioned, married a farmer whose name was Featherman, Claude Featherman, and they lived 2 miles, another mile south of the homestead.
So if we move ahead a few years, your mom and dad, how did they meet?
Well, Dad, as I say, was leasing land for a homestead, and Mother was born and raised in their house, which is just near Starbuck. And Dad being away for the 4 years after the war, he, of course, was looking for a mate, and ironically enough, Mom's mother was a fiddle player, and she used to go to barn dances and play the fiddle for everybody was dancing. In those days, there not being any radio or any television, any music you listened to was handmade, and Grandma apparently had a great reputation for really being good on the fiddle. So I would sort of think that likely that's where Mom and Dad met, and I guess they both liked square dancing, and so in 1925 they were married, and they moved to Dad's leased land, where, ironically, 4 years later, I was born. And the story goes from there. Going back to Grandma Polton, Grandma's maiden name was Zavich, and her family arrived in the USA in the early 1700s. They lived in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, and their Zavich family had started a flour mill in Pennsylvania, and were doing well until the American Revolution, at which time the Davidge family, being Empire Loyalists, United Empire Loyalists, moved to Ontario, where Grandma met Tom Polton, and they were married in Ontario, and eventually they too decided to move west and had settled in Starbuck, in a lovely little place on the LaSalle River, and where they raised a family of 3, 2 boys and Ida May. The boys were Richard and Wilford, and they formed part of the family. Grandpa Polton not only owned the homeland, but he owned a half an acre or a half a section of land 2 miles east aloft, just off the highway. And although he lived on the homestead, he also then farmed that portion of land 2 miles east, further east along the highway. So I would think that pretty well sides where Mom and Dad met. They never did tell me that, but this is just my assumption.
So tell me, any early memories of going to visit your parents, your grandparents, Otis, on the farm?
Yes, they, of course, got to remember that there was very little transportation. If you were going to go someplace, you had to set aside a whole day to get there and get back home again. But we did visit the Olsens, and Grandma Olsen was a avid gardener, and I guess that's where I take up from her zest for a garden. And I used to enjoy going to see her because we could wander in. She had fruit trees growing in the backyard, and it was always a real pleasure. And the last thing I remember was as a child, and at this time I was only about 4 years old, when Grandpa Olsen, Otis, passed away. And I have memories there of being dressed up in nice short pants and a shirt and a tie, and Dad holding me in his arms as we gave our goodbyes to Grandpa Olsen as he lay in his coffin in the house. In those days, there was no such thing as a big funeral. You died, you laid at rest in your house, and you were buried in the backyard, and that was it. The other vivid time that I can remember still visiting Grandma Olsen was when we were living in Starbuck, and my dad had an old Model T Ford, which he was constantly repairing, but it was for sure beat walking. And so on this particular day, we were traveling south to see Grandma Olsen, and the road, we call it a road in the Starbuck area. Most of the roads were built quite high up from the ditch, and the ditches were quite deep because the area had originally, I guess, been swampland, and they had done a complete irrigation system of trying to pull down the water table, and did quite well at it. Anyhow, we were driving along the road, and we're just about, well, I could see Grandma's driveway already, and all of a sudden I looked over to my left side, and there's a wheel running along the side of the road. And I said, Dad, where's that wheel coming from? He said, oh my God, hang on. And the next thing I know, we were upside down in the ditch with only 3 wheels left on the car, and the other one was still rolling. Well, needless to say, we needed more work on the old Model T Ford, and so we walked to Grandma's, and Dad got a team of horses, and we came back, and we dragged the car out of the ditch and dragged it back to Grandma's place, and eventually it ended up in our backyard in Starbuck, where Dad hoisted the back end up and put a whole new rear end into the old Model T Ford.
But you didn't spend a lot of time at your Grandma Olsen's, you said.
No, we didn't. I didn't. not that convenient, and in order to get there, it was hard to get there, and but I did spend a lot of time with Grandpa and Grandma Polton, and basically because Grandma Polton, who was my midwife and also looked after the birth of my two brothers, we were much closer to them, and we spent, as a matter of fact, I would spend weekends and so forth just for a sleep out at Grandpa and Grandma Polton's, but not so much the Olsens. It was just one of those things.
Perfect.
There's a better world that's a-comin', tell you why. There's a better world that's a-comin', tell you why. We will feed 'em on the land, on the sea, and in the sky. There's a better world that's a-comin', tell you why. There's a better world that's a-comin', don't you see? There's a better world that's a-comin', don't you see? When we'll all be union.
So what we do last time, we talked about, how much time you had spent in your youth at the Olsen farm, and then you had mentioned that you spent more time at the Poltons.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's talk about that.
All right.
Whenever you're ready.
Do you say when?
I say when.
When?
When is good.
When is good. Besides spending time with the Olsens, I spent a lot of time with the Poltons, who were my mother's parents. They were Tom Polton and his wife. They lived in a nice little 5-acre farm on the LaSalle River once again, and they had raised their family there. There was my mother Ida and her two brothers Wilfred and Richard. Wilfred was the youngest boy, and he had stayed around home while both Richard and my mother had left the homestead. My grandma Polton was a very ambitious woman. She was originally from Hungary, and she played the violin. Now I say the violin, I should say the fiddle, and played it around the neighborhood, in the area, for barn dances and gatherings over the term of each season. Grandma was also a midwife and had attended my mother when I was born, and did the same with both of my brothers, Thomas and Clifford. I used to spend time there all on my own, and I remember I had my own bedroom, and I would lay awake at night, and I would hear all the sounds of the night, the owls hooting and the coyotes barking, and it was quite an adventure for a young kid who was 4.5, 5 years old. But Grandpa Polton and Grandma did serve the background of our life in the Starbuck area. Now I want to go back to our home on what we call the river. In the spring of 1934, Dad decided to once again try his hand at farming. And so he located a farm on a quarter section, which was about 2 miles south of Starbuck. And in the early spring, we gathered up all our possessions and loaded them on a hay rack, and Grandpa Polton and the boys came over, and they herded our cattle and pigs and chickens and so forth, and moved them all to the new home at the 2 Mile Road. So much for all the nice trees and the river. Here once again we were on the bald-faced prairie. However, the house was a little bit better suited. It did have 2 bedrooms and then of course a massive kitchen and living room. Once again, no electricity, no running water. We had a well outside by the barn, and we had a big dugout that held water in reserve for the whole year in case we didn't get rain during the summertime. And this was going to become our home for the next 2 or 3 years. Also, in the move, I acquired a dog. His name was Ike, and he was a little, what they called a rat terrier. A real good friend, and loved. He and I got along great, and it was my first companion. I was sorry to have to leave the river because once again I was back onto a farm with nobody about, and so my only friend was my mom and dad, and now my dog. On the farm, we had a herd of cattle. Dad had accumulated 6 cows, and we had a good-sized barn which accommodated this, and in a large pasture. And Ike, so daily, Dad would put the cattle out after milking them in the barn in the morning. Then he would put them out to pasture, which meant driving them along a laneway and into a large grassed-in area where the cows would graze all day long, and then come supper time in the evening, we would bring the cows back, put them in the barn, and Dad would milk them again. And Ike always was involved in this, and he seemed to really enjoy the cows going back and forth. As a matter of fact, he got to a point where he had so much fun bringing the cows in that he would start doing it 2 or 3 times a day. Well, that just didn't go over too well because Dad, if the cows were running back and forth in the lane between the grazing pasture and the barn, they weren't eating and they weren't producing milk. And so we had to sort of curtail Ike, and so that he wouldn't keep doing this with the dogs. Where with the 6 cows, Dad would milk them twice a day and would produce about 2 to 4 gallons of milk a day. Of course, this was more than we could handle, but we separated the milk, which brought the cream out, and we kept the cream in milk cans. And twice a week, there was a fellow that came along and picked up our cream, and it was sent to the city, and that was one of our sources of income over the period of time, because there was very little money around, and you needed every penny you could get. Life was different on this farm. I found things to do. Dad built me a slingshot, and Mike and I would tour the area and chase up birds and chase up rats and mice in the ditch and so forth. And so he was my best friend. Mother worked in the house, and here once again I got more involved in, as I grew older, more involved in helping Mom. And one of the big features of life in those days was Laundry Day, which happened roughly every 2 weeks. And Mother would fire up the stove and bring out great big boilers and set them on the stove, and I would grab pails of water and drag them from the well, and we would get the water all boiling hot, and then it was time to do laundry. Well, Mom had 2 alternatives. One was the old washboard, and Dad had found a manually operated clothes washer, and it was made out of wooden staves put together to hold a drum, and it stood on 4 legs, and there was a handle outside, and by moving the handle back and forth, you would agitate the paddles inside the washer, and so it eliminated the old hand washing. So my job, once we filled the tub or the washer with hot water, we put all the dirty clothes in to the water, and my job was to agitate those dirty clothes by moving the handle back and forth for at least half an hour. And I guess that was one of the reasons why I ended up like I am, with broad shoulders and strong arms, because at 4.5 years old, that was a great chore to do. Anyhow, we didn't do the laundry in the house because in the summertime it was too hot, and we did it on the back porch. And as the laundry, we had the laundry tub, and then we had 2 other tubs, one with warm water in it, and one with cold water, where we would rinse the clothes. And in between the 2 and in the process was a set of rollers. And when I wasn't churning the wash tub, I was turning the rollers, which squeezed all the water out, and then Mother would go and hang all of the clothes out on a wire line to let the wind and the sun dry the stuff and clean our clothes. it was a good process, and Mom and I worked together. Another thing that I had to do, a chore that was mine, was churn the cream that we didn't sell and make butter. Now, we saved the cream in a large stone churn, and when we had accumulated maybe a couple gallons of cream in that churn, then it was my job to, here once again, churn by moving a stick with a cross on the bottom up and down through this cream, which allowed the cream then to settle. The butter would settle out, and the balance would be just water and less. So that was a job that I also got there. Once again, that process didn't happen just in a couple of minutes. A good churn to make maybe 2 pounds of butter would take a good hour of churning before it was ready to pack. So there once again, I worked with Mother because Dad was busy in the farm, and so that was the way it went. This house, like I mentioned, was 2 miles south of the town of Starbuck, and during the winter time, we were able to go outside and we could hear music that was being played at the outdoor skating rink in Starbuck, which was 2 miles away. It was the most fascinating thing I have ever experienced as a child at that age, because radios were non-existent. Well, they were to a point non-existent. Dad built me what was called a crystal set, which was a radio that didn't require power. It had a set of earphones on it, and the word crystal was a crystal that was mounted on a lead form, and by moving a piece of wire over this crystal, you could generate and pick up a radio station, CBC Winnipeg, and hear this music coming through your earphones. It was the most amazing thing that I had ever heard, because I hadn't heard music like that before, and it was so great to hear, and especially in the wintertime, the reception was fantastic, and occasionally you would get another station, Moorhead, Minnesota, would cut in, and so my time listening to it was great, especially around Christmas time, when the T. Eaton store brought Santa Claus to Winnipeg, and Santa Claus talked on that radio, and I thought that was absolutely fantastic. Interestingly enough, living on that farm, we didn't have a car still, and all the transportation was provided by our 2 horses and wagon, and we would load up. Dad would load up us in the wagon, and generally on a Saturday, we would make a trip to Starbuck, to 1, to pick up the mail, and 2, to buy whatever supplies that we would need to help us get through the next few weeks. and also to pick up our mail at the local post office. Now, speaking of mail, there was no Woolco, and there was no Zellers, and there was no stores in Starbuck at all. And however, in Winnipeg, we had the Eaton's catalog. Came out twice a year to everybody in Manitoba. And it was our department store. And I remember when the Eaton's catalog would come, I would sit for hours going through that catalog and looking at all the different things amazingly that Eaton's catalog held. And of course, this is how we did our shopping. So every spring, Mom and Dad would go through, and Dad would pick out a pair of trousers to buy, and Mom would buy a couple dresses and some underwear, and I would get a new pair of running shoes and a pair of coveralls, and sometimes some underwear. But we would then mail this to Eaton's in Winnipeg, and sure enough, in a week or 10 days, there would be a parcel at the post office in Starbuck, and there would be all our clothes that we had ordered. And it was so much fun to have. And that really, in the fall, here once again, because I was growing and I had no hand-me-downs because I was the oldest, so I would get the opportunity to pick out what I wanted to wear all winter long, and the principal items I remember was breeks. Now, breeks are what the RCMP still wear. They're pants that end just below the knee, and they've got big pockets, and you look quite smart. Well, I can remember winter coming, and I ordered a pair of breeks and moccasins to wear, and also a parka had real fur on it, fur lining, and man, it was the day of my life when that parcel arrived, and I could get all duped out for winter. Winters were very, very cold, as I recall, and houses were not insulated at all. And so, in preparation for a winter, Dad would get a roll of tar paper, and he would roll it, unroll it all around the outside of the house, and tuck the bottom into the dirt, and up to keep the drafts from blowing in underneath the house. And then he would go and get several loads of manure from the manure pile, and bank the house up right up to the windows all the way around to make the house a little bit more cozy in the wintertime. That was an annual event, was banking up the house. It started, and like I say, the winters were very intense, and occasionally we had, and this is all happening at the 2 Mile House, which in the process of getting to be 6 years old. And one winter we had a terrible blizzard, and it blew for 4 days. And it blew so bad that Dad could not go out to the barn, because the barn was 400 or 500 feet away from the house. And it was so cold in the house. We had, once again, the only heating was just the cook stove. And so Dad got blankets and nailed them to the ceiling around our cook stove. And we had to huddle inside of those blankets to keep from freezing. And those lasted 4 days. Finally, the blizzard was over, and we got out, and my God, between our house and the barn, there was a snowdrift that was higher than our house. And so my dad, instead of shoveling a path through it, he dug a tunnel through the great big snowdrift, and that was the greatest thing. Now, in relation to that same blizzard, all of our cows had stayed in the barn while the blizzard was going on, and during the process, one of our steers got loose in the barn, and he had knocked what we call a grain plate. It was a large, like we would call plywood in these days, but the steer knocked this thing over. Well, we had 4 or 5 cats in that barn, and to keep the rodents down and so forth. And so when Dad went out finally after the blizzard, we found this steer standing on top of that door, and so he put the steer back in its stall and lifted up the grain door, and lo and behold, there was one of her cats underneath that. God knows how long he had laid under it, but he was flat as a pancake. And I remember this as clearly as today. So Dad picked up the cat, and, assuming that it was dead, and he threw it out the back on top of the manure pile, and that was the end of the cat, we thought. And lo and behold, 3 or 4 days later, who should appear in the barn but that bloody cat? I guess the heat from the manure pile sort of resurrected it, and he must have used up at least 8 of his 9 lives, because he was stuck around for quite a while. Now, another form of substance on the farm was ice cream. Now, this is in early 90s, and there was no stores that sold ice cream, but in the wintertime, Mom would save the cow's cream and pour it into a tin can, which had a handle on it, and she would put it out on the clothesline. And the wind in the wintertime was constant. It was always blowing. And that can would flop back and forth in the wind for 24 hours a day for a couple days. And she would go out, take the can off of the clothesline, bring it in, and lo and behold, the cream had formed ice cream. And so as a young kid, that was the greatest delight I could ever remember having, was ice cream in the wintertime. Now, once again, that 2 Mile Farm, I can recall my first Christmas there, and Dad had gone and bought a Christmas tree, not not one of your plastic ones that you see today, but it was a piece of a jack pine, and it had needles on it, and God knows when it was cut, but because it was pretty dry. But we set that up and in the farm for Christmas, and Mom made a whole great big bowl of popcorn, popped the corn, and our job was we took a needle and a thread and we threaded all this corn on for decorations and hung it on the tree. We had little metal clips that we were able to put actual candles in these little candle holders and clip them on the tree. We didn't light the candles because it was only be a one-time effort. But I remember on Christmas Eve, it was a big event. We had the presents, what presents there were, under the tree, and then Dad got out his matches and he lit those half a dozen candles, and we sat and watched them burn. And I think today back, what a wonderful thing that was, because when I see all of the electric candles today, they don't even come close to the thrill that I got just seeing those candles burn on our tree after having decorated it. And we let them burn for 5 minutes and then put them all out and took them off the tree. But that was a lifetime memory that I'll always remember. Then the next morning, we were able to open our presents. The presents were all handmade. Mom had knit me a couple pair of socks, and my dad built me a log cabin with sticks, something like your modern day Meccano maybe, but all of the logs would split together and you could pile them up, and then there was a piece of cardboard for a roof. And he had whittled it all by hand, and that was his present for me. And it was great. Just the Christmas with just the three of us, and Ike, and that was our Christmas. Well, life continued at the 2 Mile Farm. The fall of 1935 came up, and 1936 was the big year in my life, because I turned 6 years old, and that meant I could go to school, something I had been looking forward to for years and years and years. So September the 4th came along, and there I was. I had my lunch box. I had my school supplies, which consisted of a ruler and a couple pencils and a pencil box, which was supposed to contain all my worldly belongings that I needed at school. September the 4th came along, and of course we didn't have any form of transportation other than horse and buggy. So I had to make my way to school by way of the bus. Well, the bus in 1936 was a 4-wheel wagon with a box on it and a canvas roof over it, and it was pulled by 2 horses. And so school started at 8 o'clock, or at 9 o'clock, I guess. And around 8:15, who should pull up in front of the house on the road but the school bus, and it was driven by my grandfather, Tom Polton. And off we went to the first day in school on my own. And I was apprehensive as could be, but hey, this is what I've been waiting for, the chance to learn, which had always been foremost in my mind. So Grandpa dropped all of us there. I think there were 6 kids in the school bus, dropped us off in front of the school. I had never seen the school before, and I had no idea. But the school was a massive, to my mind, a massive building. It was 2-story. It was made out of brick and stone. And it contained 4 classrooms and taught 1 to 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and 1 teacher for each of the 4 rooms. So I stayed outside and saw all these new kids that I'd never seen before, and tried to get to know some of them. I have an idea that people my size were likely going to grade 1, but I didn't know. So then, come 9 o'clock, the school principal rang a bell, and we all gathered at the front stairs of the old school. And the teachers came along and allotted us to groups, who would be in room number 1 and who would go to room number 2 and so forth. And turns out I was in room number 1 with all the other kids that were starting school that day. It was very, very interesting because I hadn't had the opportunity to play with kids. I knew a couple of the neighbors. They were all boys. I hadn't really met a girl of my age ever. But as I say, the principal greeted us all, and somebody came along and they raised the Union Jack, which flew over top of our school every day, and then invited everybody into start day of school. So I walked into the classroom, and there was a whole lineup of desks and chairs, and I didn't want to take the front one, so I took one in the middle, and we all sat down, and the teacher came in and introduced herself, and we all then in turn stood up and gave our names and so forth. And then we started to learn what it was like to go to school. Now, I in the previous times had been taught by my mother how to read, and also how to write. Not to write, but to print. And so I was getting kind of fidgety, and when some of this stuff was, because I already knew that. But anyhow, the morning progressed, and all of a sudden, school bell rang again. Well, it meant it was recess. So now I knew the people in our room, so we all went outside to play. the school ground was massive. It covered 4 or 5 acres and had swings and teeter-totters and lots of bush around. And over in one corner, it had a great big slide, which we would be using in the wintertime to slide down the riverbank and out onto the river. So talking to the new guys in our room, all of a sudden they're using a language that I had never heard before. It was like swearing. I think, hey, that's a cool idea, you know. So the school bell rings again, and we go in for our last period in the morning, and then comes lunchtime, and I'm able to take out my lunch bucket, and Mom had made some sandwiches, a couple sandwiches, and a little bit of sweets, and so it was neat. We all just sat in our classroom and had our lunch, and then it was time to go outside and play for the lunch hour. And after that, come into school, and I found it quite interesting. However, as I had mentioned, I learned some new words, and I really didn't know what to think about them. They were kind of neat. So over the progress of the next couple weeks, I used these words 2 or 3 times in school. And all of a sudden, the teacher comes down and stands me up and said, "You mustn't use those words around because that's swearing. And if I hear them again, I'm going to have to wash your mouth out." Oh, okay, that sounds like not too much fun. But a week or so later, I slipped again. And I had to go and sit in the corner. And the teacher came along, and she had a little piece of soap, which she took off a piece and put it on my tongue, and then gave me a glass of water, and I had to sort of swirl it all around. God, it tasted awful, but I got my mouth washed out for swearing, and I never swore again in school, that's for sure. This was a secret that I kept from Mom and Dad, though, when I came home. But the time at school was really precious. And as you can recall, I had never been with kids before. When all of a sudden, as fall progressed, I started to catch communicable diseases because I had absolutely no protection of them. So one morning I got up and I wasn't feeling good, and I was sitting in the kitchen waiting for the bus to come along, and Mom says, "You don't look so good. Open your mouth." So I opened my mouth, and she puts her hand on my forehead. She says, "You got a temperature, you're not going to school." It turned out that I had a parched throat. And that was just the start. It was start, and almost regularly, at least twice a month, sometimes 3 times a month, I would wake up and I would have something new. I went through mumps, and mumps are kind of interesting because you can become immune if you have mumps on both sides at once, at the same time. But if you have mumps only on one side, then you can get mumps on the other side later on. And guess what? had them later on. And then there was measles. There was the German measles, in which you had pustules growing out on your face and on your body, and they itched, and you couldn't go to school. And then I had red measles, which were even worse, and I survived that. And then we had something different. It was called chicken pox, and we had that. And I was so disappointed because all of this time I couldn't go to school when I had these diseases, so I would go to school for 3 or 4 days and then get something new and be off school for a week or so, and feeling better, I go back to school and hey, you got something new. However, I did survive everything, and as winter approached, I became sort of immune. And as the days got shorter and the weather got cooler, I got dressed for school with my winter clothes on. Now, I don't think people wear this anymore, but the standard dress for that time of the year was long underwear, heavy socks, breeks, a shirt, generally a plaid shirt, and sometimes a sweater. And I got outfitted with brand new clothes to start off the fall season at school. And I think the second day, well, it snowed, and then all of a sudden our magical school wagon turned into a school sleigh, which was the same box and the same canvas top, but it had benches inside, and it had a tiny little coal stove, which with a chimney out through the roof of the bus, and we were able to keep warm. So the school bus would come along. We would hop in, and there'd be all the people that I knew who were in various classes. But it was a great time riding in the winter time, because people would jump out the back of the school and run along behind the sleigh, and then grab a hold of the sleigh and slide on your moccasins, and it was fun and games. And we would go to school. Now, as the season progressed, I had mentioned earlier that on the school ground there was this big slide, which was built for the kids to play on. It was situated on the riverbank, and the slide was made of galvanized tin. And so this particular Monday, I showed up for school, and in our morning recess, we all went sliding on this slide. And I was wearing my brand new breeks. And so I went down the slide, and all of a sudden I felt a rip, and I ended up at the bottom of the slide, put my hand back to my backside, and I found that I had ripped the whole back end of my breeks out on a nail or something on that damn slide. So I was absolutely finished. I just cried and cried and cried, and the school teacher who was looking after the school ground at that luncheon took me to my room, my schoolroom, and there was my teacher there, and she said, "Donnie, what's the matter?" And I said, I just ripped the back of my breeks out. Well, she said, "You can't have that. So here, come into the cloakroom and we'll fix this up." Well, to make a long story short, she put me on her knee, upside down, and she proceeded with a needle and thread to sew up the back of my trousers so that my underwear didn't show. And what a way to get an introduction to your teacher. But we had an intimate time there. That was the culmination of my first year at school.
From town to town. Now fellas, don't believe what a bad woman tells you, though her eyes be blue or brown, unless she's standing on some old scaffold high, saying fellas, they won't let me come